thank, on our behalf, President Xi Jinping for having accepted to participate in this exchange of views on the occasion of a bilateral state visit. The dialogue between China and Europe has become absolutely essential for world balances and for preserving multilateralism, especially in the current circumstances, an unprecedented crisis. We have just had, all four of us, a 1-hour discussion, a very fruitful, free discussion covering bilateral relations between the European Union and China and our visions of multilateralism are very constructive. 4 points of convergence. The first point of convergence, the need to develop powerful multilateralism in terms of international peace and security. And I must say, in this regard, there has been real cooperation between the EU and China, for example, to preserve the 2015 agreement on Iranian nuclear power. We have adopted a similar perspective, joint project for denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. And that is the direction in which we wish to work together to do more in terms of developing security in Africa, where China and Europe are very active. The second point of convergence is to develop multilateralism regarding climate change. Indeed, we must meet an emergency in this regard. The Secretary General of the United Nations sent us a word emphasizing the importance of the climate change agenda, which will be at the top of the agenda at the next summit meeting in September. We have the means of taking action. At the G20, we triggered the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Now we have to go a step further. The bilateral agreement between China and France, which was made public this morning, is a very powerful step forward. And I would like to thank President Xi Jinping for the clear indications he has given regarding China's ambitions in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the will to participate in concrete measures to finance development, and the implementation of the Kigali Amendment. This is a key battle we will be fighting together in order to meet our international commitments in regard to climate change. The EU will be present to ensure the leadership. This climate change agenda, in addition to security and peace, is a very important component of the multilateralism in which we strongly believe. The third point of convergence is the need for the partnership between Europe and China to be exemplary in terms of the spirit of cooperation based on multilateralism. We need to develop a strategic trust between us. We discussed at length partnership, friendship, rivalry, which exists and which are part of the world in which we live. Our will, our determination is to develop strategic confidence. The EU and China form one of the major poles, one of the major economic centers of the world. The EU, the European market has witnessed this spectacular. 700 million people have been freed of poverty in China. At the same time, the country has deeply changed. And we know that when change exists, there are tensions in society. There are imbalances which emerge in terms of social impact. And this calls for a legitimate desire for greater protection. Our common will is to avoid the fracturing of the World Trade Organization with new trade conflicts and new tendencies towards isolationism. What we want to develop is a renovated multilateral framework, more fair, fairer, more balanced. The EU is one of the most open economies in the world. We want to work together during the China-EU summit. We will be focusing, and the G20 in Osaka. We will be working on a joint agenda for modernizing commercial or trade multilateralism in our common interest and in the interest of the planet as a whole, to develop new forms of loyal competition and to develop this new balance, these new balances. So in this regard, we must accelerate the work undertaken between China and the EU to modernize the World Trade Organization based on cooperation, transparency, and to reduce regulations, and to we discussed this at great length. So the challenge is to show that in practice, cooperation is more fruitful than conflict. We have more to gain from opening up than from closing up. Here too, the partnership between Europe and China will be and must be exemplary, producing tangible results at the next China-EU summit meeting, notably the global agreement on geographical indications and investments. The fourth point of convergence is the need to strengthen our dialogue to achieve a common view of the future of multilateralism through initiatives on both sides. China today plays the role which is commensurate with its power and its rank. The Silk Road initiative that you have proposed to the world is a very important decision which could contribute to stability, peaceful coexistence between the peoples and so on. For its part, the EU, which is the largest contributor to development aid, will also play its role on the international stage. And I think it's by connecting up these initiatives that we'll be able to build something innovative and of great structural importance. We must define, and I believe we can, a joint agenda whereby we'll be able to develop infrastructures and facilities, meet our climate change commitments, have an educational and healthcare policies which are very powerful, and to have a financially sustainable agenda for all the third-party countries that join us in these initiatives. If we achieve the joint framework we discussed this morning, we'll be able not only help many countries to get out of poverty, but also to do so in an inclusive and sustainable way. And this is where I see what I can see new balancing links that we can. There are multiple routes. These new links can be created and can be used to build this new multilateralism and this new cooperation framework. All in all, to achieve these objectives, powerful multilateralism, a spirit of cooperation, and striking a new balance, we wish to develop a renovated form of multilateralism. We have differences of view, exercising power. There are rivalries between us. We are also rivals. We are not naive, but we respect China, and we are determined to engage in a dialogue and cooperation with China. And we expect our major partners to respect the EU's unity, its values, for its part and for the world. And on the basis of this respect for sovereignty, the development of new balances, and the development of a renovated and loyal framework, I think we have, dear friends, Mr. President, the makings of a new link, of new ties. This is what I wish to say about our discussions. Confucius used to say there are three sorts of friends are useful and three are not useful. The useful friends is who is honest, faithful, and cultivated, educated. A bad friend is a false friend, soft and talkative friend. Mr. the President of the Republic of China, you have in this room, you have friends who are very demanding, who are loyal to what they are and to their friendship with China, and to avoid being too talkative, I'm going to stop there, and with pleasure I'm now going to give you the floor. And I thank you once again for being with us today.
Mr. President, Madam Chancellor, Mr. President of the European Commission, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. In these first days of spring here in Paris, Paris is full of life, and during my visit here in France, I had the pleasure of being invited to the closing seminar between France and China on worldwide governance. There were many constructive discussions during that conference, and with very constructive results. I'd like to thank the participants for the invitation and congratulate them on the success of their work. Yesterday, during our discussions, I was able to talk in detail with President Macron on worldwide governance. And indeed, both France and China are major important players in world governance. As regards the peace and international security, multilateralism, and trade, and a very active role at the United Nations and elsewhere, and there's a very strong basis for cooperation. So both countries are in favor of equality, tolerance, benefits for all, and we both defend the standards in international relations in favor of good governance and preservation of peace and stability in the world. A moment ago, we had a discussion, the four of us, for about an hour with President Macron, Chancellor Merkel, and President Jean-Claude Juncker. We discussed multilateralism, development, China-EU cooperation. And indeed, we reached a number of points of convergence. 2 years ago, in a speech I made at the United Nations in Geneva, I asked the following question: what is the situation of the world today, and what must we do? Today's world is undergoing major changes. Peace and development are still topical themes of the day, and yet the world is faced with uncertainty, growing uncertainty, and humanity has had to deal with growing challenges. It's said that in France, everyone is the head of one's own destiny. Given the global challenges, and given the choices that we must make at this crossroads, our countries must take on the necessary commitment in order to be active and not simply observe, in order to be the true artisans of the future of humanity. We must adopt a fair and reasonable approach in order to remedy the insufficiencies of governance, international news, the issues such as climate change, cybersecurity, migration crisis. All of these issues continue being a source of worry. And it is world governance and the multilateral system that suffers. We must adopt worldwide governance principles on the basis of cooperation and reciprocal benefits between all of the peoples of the world. When we're talking about worldwide issues, promote the democratization of world governance. We must also continue raising high the standard of multilateralism represented by the United Nations and play a constructive role in international multilateralism and regionalism such as WTO, IMF, the G20, the European Union, and to build together the community of destiny for humanity. Secondly, we must encourage mutual consultation in order to deal with the lack of confidence. Confidence is the best glue for international relations. Today, competition and international friction continue rising, and more there are geopolitical conflicts, whereas confidence and trust become weakened. Mutual respect and reciprocal confidence must be emphasized, along with dialogue and consultation. We must find areas of convergence through dialogue in order to develop mutual strategic confidence and decrease distrust. It's the concept of seeking out the best outcome for all, and at the same time sharing in the good days and the bad days. We must reinforce exchange and dialogue between different cultures in order to further our understanding and reciprocal knowledge of each other in order to develop confidence and respect amongst all peoples of the world. The relations between France, between China and Europe today are particularly relations of cooperation. There is competition, but it's positive competition. Cooperation is the main aspect, and we must provide positive energy. Together, we are moving forward. We must not allow distrust to make us look to the past or lead us to distrusting partners who are standing side by side with us. We must avoid worrying about these various different gestures of our partners. It's extremely important for us. We must not look to the past. We must continue cooperation in order to deal with the lack of peace. This is the second deficit. We have the environment, and the security environment today is a source of worry. The terrorism is continuing, and more children are suffering from the effects of war. We must seek for sustainable, long-lasting, cooperative solutions, doing away with the impact of the Cold War and the zero-sum game that led to. and we must continue working in favor of peace and security and settling our differences by peaceful means, avoiding the use of force. We must continue being against causing conflict for egotistical reasons or trying to harm others for one's own profit. The countries of the world must move ahead in order to reach worldwide peace. Fourthly, we must always seek out shared benefits in favor of development. Economic globalization is the engine for worldwide growth. Today, the anti-globalization movements are continuing, and the negative effects of protectionism are getting worse. The geographical balances of development have become the most acute problems of worldwide governance. Innovation must become the engine of development in order to find a dynamic form of growth. We must emphasize coordination for open win-win cooperation and favor equity and tolerance in order to develop balanced growth for all. In order for economic globalization to benefit all of the peoples of the world. China will most certainly continue in its reforms and openness. For 40 years now, China has been walking on that path, which has made it possible for China to reform enormously. In 40 years, we have succeeded in doing what Western countries took 3 centuries to achieve. We will continue moving forward, and this means that we will continue being open and continue developing this openness given the new requirements of the day. China is supports the reform of the World Trade Organization for an open worldwide economy, multilateral trade, and more healthy development of globalization. The Belt and Road Initiative is based on this concept of multilateralism. Cooperation through this initiative is an important means of promoting the growth of the world economy and carrying out our common development. France, along with all of the countries of the world, are welcome to participate in this initiative. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, China and France are joined by a very old friendship. This is the 55th anniversary of diplomatic relations between China and France. We have already begun strategic cooperation, which is very promising. And indeed, it's from the Eiffel Tower that you have the best view of Paris. In today's new context, we must take the high view and look to the future in order to reinforce our cooperation. We must develop our cooperation in the traditional areas such as civilian and nuclear energy, agrospatial, and other areas. We must accelerate in future areas such as open manufacturing, digital economy, artificial intelligence, and sustainable development in the urban environment, and also reinforce our cooperation on climate change. Implementing the Paris Agreement so that the UN Climate Summit be able to reach positive results for the well-being of both our peoples, but for the people of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, The advance of history, the prosperity of civilizations, and the prosperity of peoples will never be possible without advanced thinking. The seminar has given major support to both peoples in their participation and energy given to world development. I hope that both France and China will continue this fluid dialogue and will continue the dialogue in the spirit of win-win cooperation in order to continue developing the strength of our countries. Thank you. Thank you, Presidents. I would like to begin by thanking President Macron for having invited Jean-Claude Juncker and myself to show indeed that multilateralism also applies to the European Union, because the European Union is itself a multilateral program, and we intend to speak with one voice. We've had a very interesting discussion. In addition to what was accomplished yesterday, multilateralism always starts with good bilateral relations, and the bilateral relations between the EU and China played a very important role. We've seen that there's been a dynamic evolution in the international context. Things have evolved very rapidly, but we need to find a new balance, as President Macron said, balance in a period of major disorder. We have strategic partnerships. We've spoken about competition and rivalry. These words need to be clearly defined so that there's no misunderstanding. The very idea of strategic competition has a positive connotation. It means that each partner, each actor must play a role in improving performance. There are a number of important dates coming up. April 8th, the EU-China summit. And I've already stated, and I'm happy to see that China sees this very positively. We, in Germany, we will be presiding the European Union in next January, and we intend to organize a summit between the 27 member countries and China. And I hope that we will be able to reach an agreement on investments as well as a number of other areas. The One Belt, One Road initiative, it's a very major project. As Europeans, we want to play a role indeed in this One Belt, One Road initiative. But there needs to be reciprocity. It's still a wee bit difficult to find how this reciprocity can function, but I think it is an excellent way of endeavoring to understand the interdependence between China and the European Union. In addition, multilateralism as a foundation for international relations, clearly since the Second World War, which brought so much pain and suffering, we have had a period of 75 years, which has enabled us to go beyond that horrible period. And that's what's made it possible to build up the multilateral world that we have today. Now, the question is, are we able to continue pursuing multilateralism in the upcoming period? Are we going to enable it to evolve, or is it going to become something far too rigid that will fall by the wayside simply because it no longer corresponds to our expectations. In today's discussions, I really had the impression that each of the participants want to bring their contributions so that multilateralism continue existing, the reform of the international organizations, reform of the IMF, of the WTO, as we decided in the G20. We're going to be reactivating the G20, implementing the various agreements, and that's why it's extremely important that we receive the message from the United Nations. So when you take a look at these initiatives, you realize that competition, it's not so much a winner and a loser. On the contrary, in a framework of multilateralism, you can indeed have a win-win approach. It isn't going to be to the detriment of the other party. So it's important for us to fight. We need to fight for that goal. There needs to be a climate, an atmosphere of mutual confidence, mutual trust, so that each country not simply think of its own interests and values. Today, in a world of digital technology, that's quite a challenge. We also spoke about the triangle US, EU, and China, and that's extremely important in terms of multilateralism, and that's why we're following very closely the trade negotiations between the USA and China. From the German point of view, what I can say is, were these negotiations to fail, we would feel the impact quite strongly in Germany, because this would lead to an imbalance in today's situation and would have an impact on the German economy. Fourthly, there needs to be growing cooperation with third countries. It's in our interest to have a development agenda for Africa. Indeed, the European Union is a next-door neighbor to Africa. And China has shown the example of how people can be lifted up from poverty in a very short period of time, and therefore we must learn from that example and draw the consequences and conclusions that can apply to Africa. And if we can do that, that will be very useful for multilateralism. Thank you very much for making this very fruitful discussion possible, and thank you for having invited us here.
La Commission et les nouvelles technologies, ça ne va pas ensemble. Monsieur le Président, Madame la Chancelière, je suis le dernier.
I am the last speaker. I will not be the last friend of China. Since my first visit to China in 1996, I was a minister. I fell in love with China, like Mr. Raffarin, whom I salute in a very friendly way. I don't know why you are laughing. He's a friend of China and my friend, and I like love of China and the love of my friend Raffarin go together. He who loves finds the right words and doesn't need to make long speeches, so I'm going to be brief. I think that China and Europe can and should do great things together for themselves and for the world. They should do so not in a confrontational way, but in a cooperative way based on confidence. We are partners, strategic partners. We are competitors as well. We have our interests to defend, and we are rivals. I have learned that some Chinese people don't like us to say that we see China as a rival, but it's a compliment. It's a compliment because it describes our common ambitions. It describes the necessary and inevitable competition between us, and it informs the spirit of our relations. The President of the Republic associated the Commission with this meeting because the Commission is responsible for organizing our commercial relations, our trade relations with the outside world. The next summit between China and the EU with President Tusk and myself will be on April the 8th and 9th. I'm looking forward to this summit meeting with great hope. I don't want us to write only beautiful poems, but that we apply our commitments, we implement the commitments we have made. So I would like us to revitalize our working group, and under the aegis of the World Trade Organization, we must talk together about how to reform the World Trade Organization, which is necessary. It's an irreplaceable organization, but it needs to be reformed. I would like to set up between China and the European Union, a reciprocity, a better linked up reciprocity, because European companies must find the same access to the Chinese market as Chinese companies have access to European markets. A greater degree of opening. I would like our European companies to have as easy access to China as Chinese companies have access to Europe. And I'd like us to come as quickly as possible to an agreement on investments. There too, we must rebalance our relationship. And I would like us also to agree on protection of geographic indications, geolocations. This is all part of the new Silk Road initiative. I think the Europeans, we must explain to our fellow citizens that it's not against the Silk Way project, is not against Europe. On the contrary, Europe must see it as an opening, and this vision of the President of China is opening his country up through this project. We must all find, in the implementation of this great project, we must all find our interest, defend. I don't want investments to be exclusively Chinese, but they should also benefit the Europeans and the transit countries through which the Silk Way will go. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, President, Chancellor, and thank you to all those who have organized this seminar. Thank you very much.